In the remote deserts of the American Southwest, beneath endless skies and across windswept plains, a hidden tragedy unfolded for decades, a tragedy that would remain largely buried beneath layers of government secrecy, scientific denial, and the slow, painful silence of suffering communities. These were the Downwinders, ordinary citizens, farmers, ranchers, teachers, children, who lived downwind of the U.S. government's nuclear testing sites. Their lives were quietly shattered by the invisible fallout of atomic ambition, and their cries for justice would echo unanswered for generations. The story begins in the 1940s, when the world was locked in a brutal war and the United States was racing to develop the deadliest weapon known to mankind. The Manhattan Project brought together the brightest minds in science and engineering under a veil of extreme secrecy. Its purpose: to build an atomic bomb before the Nazis could. The first successful detonation of a nuclear device, codenamed Trinity, took place on July 16, 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto desert of New Mexico. The bomb exploded with a force equal to 21,000 tons of TNT, lighting up the sky and sending a radioactive plume thousands of feet into the air. What was not revealed at the time was how dangerously close the test site was to populated areas. The government had chosen New Mexico for its sparse population and isolation, but sparse did not mean uninhabited. Within a 50-mile radius of the Trinity site were ranches, small towns, and Native American communities. As the mushroom cloud rose, particles of plutonium, iodine-131, and cesium-137 drifted through the atmosphere. These particles settled on houses, in water sources, and on the skin of children playing outdoors. The people didn't know what they were breathing in. They had never heard of fallout. No warnings were given. No evacuations were ordered. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. Cattle were born deformed. Chickens dropped dead in their coops. Fruit trees bore twisted, inedible fruit. And then, people began to fall ill. Cancers, rare diseases, unexplained stillbirths. But the cause remained a mystery. No one told them they had been exposed to radiation. The government said nothing. Officially, the Trinity test was a success, and its dark consequences were swiftly buried in classified files. As the Cold War intensified, the United States ramped up its nuclear arsenal. Between 1951 and 1962, over 100 atmospheric nuclear tests were conducted at the Nevada test site, just 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. These tests were larger, more powerful, and more frequent. The winds, ever unpredictable, often carried radioactive fallout across hundreds of miles, into Utah, Arizona, Idaho, and beyond. Once again, no one warned the people living downwind. Children played outside as radioactive snow drifted from the sky. Mothers hung laundry on lines while invisible poisons settled onto their clothes. Farmers milked cows whose grass had absorbed radioactive isotopes. And once again, sickness followed. Thyroid cancer rates soared. Leukemia cases appeared in clusters. Women miscarried in alarming numbers. Entire families were struck by multiple cancers, so many that some communities began calling it the family curse. Yet no one could see the enemy. There were no bombs falling from planes, no sirens, no blood in the streets, only quiet suffering year after year. The federal government refused to acknowledge the connection between nuclear testing and the health crises unfolding downwind. When Downwinders began asking questions in the 1960s and 70s, they were met with dismissals and denials. Officials claimed the tests were safe, that fallout levels were well within acceptable limits. But the truth was far more sinister. Declassified documents later revealed that scientists had known the risks. They had studied the dispersion of fallout. They had even modeled which towns would receive the heaviest doses of radiation. Yet they had proceeded anyway, calculating that the military necessity outweighed the collateral damage to American citizens. By the 1980s, the Downwinders had organized. They formed support groups, held public meetings, and demanded recognition. Survivors stood before Congress and told their stories, of watching neighbors die young, of burying children, of spending life savings on treatments for illnesses that no doctor could explain. Some brought photographs, others brought medical records. All brought the same question: why? One of the most haunting testimonies came from a woman named Irene Allen, a Utah resident who had lost her husband and 2 daughters to cancer. She described the pink dust that had fallen after one test, the strange taste in the air, the burning eyes. Her words were soft, but they cut deep. We didn't know we were being poisoned. We just thought it was part of life. In 1990, after decades of denial, the U.S. government finally passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, which provided limited financial compensation to downwinders and uranium workers. It was a small victory, one that came too late for many. The payments were modest, the criteria strict. Entire communities were excluded due to arbitrary geographic lines. For example, many New Mexicans, those closest to the Trinity test, were not even eligible for compensation. The irony was bitter. The first victims of America's nuclear age had been entirely left out of the nation's only attempt at justice. Scientific studies over the years have confirmed what the Downwinders always knew in their bones. Fallout from U.S. nuclear tests caused significant health damage. A National Cancer Institute report in 1997 estimated that tens of thousands of thyroid cancer cases could be linked to iodine-131 exposure from nuclear tests. The full extent of the damage, however, is impossible to measure. Radiation doesn't leave fingerprints. It works slowly, mutating cells, disrupting DNA, sowing seeds that bloom into tumors decades later. But perhaps the cruelest part of this story is the psychological toll. Downwinders were not only sick, they were disbelieved. Many were told their illnesses were coincidental, that their suffering was imagined. They felt abandoned by their own country, betrayed by the very government that claimed to protect them. The phrase, patriotic sacrifice, was sometimes used to justify the testing program. But the Downwinders had not volunteered for this sacrifice. They had not enlisted. They were collateral damage in a secret war, patriots drafted without their knowledge. Today, the deserts where bombs once roared are quiet. The test sites are empty, the craters overgrown. But the legacy of nuclear testing lives on in the bodies and memories of those who lived nearby. In places like St. George, Utah, and Tularosa, New Mexico, survivors still gather to remember and to fight for recognition. They light candles for lost loved ones, read names aloud, and demand that their history not be erased. And yet, mainstream America rarely hears about the Downwinders. Their story is not taught in most schools. Their suffering is not memorialized in grand monuments. The term downwinder itself remains unfamiliar to many. This erasure is no accident. It is the result of decades of deliberate neglect, of a national narrative that prefers heroes and victory to victims and accountability. Some Downwinders have found hope in activism. They've built grassroots movements, lobbied Congress, and partnered with filmmakers and journalists to share their story. They've pushed for expansions to RECA, hoping to include overlooked communities and extend compensation eligibility. They know time is running out. Many of the original Downwinders are elderly. Each year, more pass away without receiving justice. Their fight is not just about money. It's about acknowledgement. About hearing the words, "Yes, this happened. Yes, it was wrong." It's about restoring dignity to lives that were quietly shattered. It's about making sure future generations understand the cost of nuclear power, not just in megatons and deterrence, but in human lives. In recent years, attention has slowly returned to the Downwinder story. Documentaries, investigative reports, and books have brought new light to the tragedy. Some lawmakers have championed efforts to expand RECA, and there is growing recognition that the Downwinders are not a relic of the past, they are a warning for the future. As the world once again grapples with nuclear threats and renewed arms races, the Downwinders' story reminds us of the real cost of these weapons. Not just the destruction they cause abroad, but the damage they inflict at home. Not just the radiation that scars the earth, but the silence that follows. In the end, the story of the Downwinders is not just a story of suffering, it's a story of resilience. Of communities who refused to be silenced. Of families who turned pain into purpose. Of ordinary Americans who bore the weight of a nation's ambitions, and who now ask, simply, to be remembered. Because history is not just what we choose to celebrate. It is also what we choose to confront. And the Downwinders deserve more than a footnote in the nuclear age. They deserve our full attention. They deserve justice. And they deserve to finally be heard.